Emily Maitlis, she doesn't really need any introduction, but she's written for the New World newspaper, which, along with Private Eye, are the only two publications that I pay actual money to subscribe to, and they drop through my letterbox, and with increasing importance, because they both chronicle the madness that some people are either looking away from or failing to properly record. And Emily is back from the United States of America, where she has been looking at the reality on the ground. And one of the things I enjoyed about your article, Emily, if I may refer to it, was the reminder to those of us of a certain disposition not to fall into the liberal trap. Barack Obama oversaw more deportations than any other US president. As you remind us, the figure is north of 3 million. So with that in the background, what did you discover on this trip?
We've been covering the story pretty comprehensively since Trump came back into power last January. But it's much harder, I think, to get a sense from here of what is really happening on the ground. So we decided that the newsagents team just wanted to be out. We didn't know what we were going to find. We didn't know, frankly, that we would find anything. But it felt important to just be on the ground, talking to people inside communities. And as you say, US president after US president has made deportation quite a sort of main plank of their campaigns. Barack Obama is one of the highest, his administration deported the highest number of illegal immigrants when he was in power, as you say, north of 3 million. But what we found, and it takes you right back to Trump's Republican convention in 2024 when he became nominated, he started putting on all the chairs these signs that said mass deportation now, and people were literally picking them up and waving them. And I think that was a turning point, because this was no longer about criminals, which he'd started by saying, we need to deport the rapists and the criminals and the killers and the murderers. And it was no longer even about people who had tried to scam the system or come in through the back door or hadn't been invited in or had been in illegally. It was people who were in the system. It was people who were living in America for decades, who had been part of communities, who had actually gone through the system to apply for citizenship and were working in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, legally. And this is what we found is actually happening now on the streets. Minneapolis has been targeted because it's a very blue state, because Trump is sort of latching on to its past, not least its connections with the George Floyd murder, and also with a very tangible fraud scandal that has been going on, that is going through the courts in Minneapolis. And so he has essentially zoned in, made this the sort of centre of his crosshairs. And what we found there were communities who are having the hearts ripped out of them, quite frankly. There are kids coming home from schools who find one or other parent has disappeared. There are people wandering around parking lots, elderly people finding their son's car and not knowing where their son is. There are people who are appearing in shackles, about to board deportation flights, dark flights, still wearing an Amazon Union of their morning's work or a construction high-vis vest of their morning's work. In other words, what I'm trying to explain here is there is no due process going on. It is not about the deportation per se. It is about the fact that these are people who in many, many cases were legitimately, legally in the United States and who have been removed in shackles on these dark flights with no due process. There is no way that somebody would still be in their uniform in the morning if they'd actually gone through a process with a lawyer, with an exchange of letters, with somebody to take them through the legal process. The fact that it is happening so quickly is what tells us that this administration, quite frankly, is not comfortable with doing things above board. And just to try and put this in context, because I can imagine your listeners and they'll be pushing back and they'll be saying, well, come on, if these people shouldn't be in the country, we should get them out. They should be got out. Isn't that what should be happening? And if they stood on a campaign to remove people from America and that's what people want, then what's so wrong? And I'll tell you what's wrong. We were with a guy who describes himself as a plane spotter. I mean, that is where he approaches this story from. He's passionate about planes. He goes to Minneapolis St. Paul's Airport the whole time. And he knows that every Wednesday in the past, there used to be a deportation flight. And he would monitor it and he would see that and he would look at it along with other flights. And then one day, last year, the deportation flights on a Wednesday stopped. They dried up and they were removed from the schedule around about April or May of last year. And that was when he got interested, because he said, if the deportation flights are now being removed from the schedule, if there is less transparency, what is happening? And so he and his group of sort of plane spotters, a crowdsource, they call themselves MN5051, the sort of, they essentially monitor from the skies all the planes coming in and landing through US airspace to try and get a sense of the picture. And he has built up this picture. And he and his cohort are monitoring every single plane that leaves Minneapolis, St. Paul, any plane that leaves Minnesota, essentially the state, because they are being taken to detention centers in El Paso, detention centers in Nebraska. And because there are people watching the El Paso plane leave, and because there is Nick Benson watching the El Paso plane come in exactly 2 hours and 20 minutes later, and these planes do not exist on any aviation schedule. There is nothing written down. There is no place that you can go and say, oh, can I just check what time the deportation flight's coming in? Oh, can I just check that? What's on that? Why is there no transparency and more regularity? And so for him, and I think for us, that was the question. If you are writing things down, if they are part of your schedules, if you know there is a weekly plane and you know that the due process has been gone through and illegal people, criminal people have been deported, then you have to put that in the context of, well, this is what administrations do and this is what American people voted for. When those planes disappear from the schedule and when the number ramps up, and Nick has now counted 27 flights in January of this year alone. That is more than 2,000 people have been deported since January of this year alone from one airport in one state in the United States.
And just to stress some of the points you've made, thanks to Nick, he's spoken also of airport employees being picked up, which means people who have been vetted and are fit and suitable to work in some very high security scenarios are just being scooped up while at work or on their way home from work or on the school run or going about their legal business, scooped up and stuck on these planes and removed from the country with, as you say, no record, no transparency, no accountability. There's two questions, isn't there? There's always two questions. How aware is the average American of what is going on, and how comfortable is the aware American with what is going on?
I think if you had been living in New York or California, or actually many of the southern states where none of this was particularly visible, you would have been sort of fine with it until now. You would have assumed that he was carrying out an election pledge to remove killers, rapists, murderers, drug addicts from the streets of America, and you would have said, well, that's what the American people voted for. That is no longer what is happening. He is decimating communities. He is targeting immigrant communities. And as I say, there is no legal redress. And the point you just made is very important. If you have a job in an airport, if you are working on the TSA side, on the high security side, you have gone through the system. You have shown your papers. You have proved that you are allowed to work in places of high security. The fact that even airport employees are finding themselves now on the other side, shackled in manacles. There are manacles on these people as they are led up the stairs to deportation flights. The fact that even these people are disappearing. The fact that you will go to, for example, the Mercado Central, the sort of central Latino market neighborhood, and find that of the 42 businesses that used to be up and operating and alive and swinging. 35 of them no longer dare open their doors because people don't want to come to work in case they are pulled from their places of work, and people don't want to shop there because they don't want to be targeted as part of the Latino community. So we are seeing something now which is so arbitrary. I mean, I say arbitrary, but clearly it's not arbitrary in the way that it is targeting certain groups of immigrant communities, but it is so mindlessly cruel, actually, what is going on. There is no reason you would have to take somebody's son without telling their parents. There is no reason you'd have to use a 5-year-old child to get in the house to their father. There is no reason. If you believed in the legality and the sense of what you were doing, you wouldn't have to hide this stuff.
And so, I mean, it's in danger of becoming a cliche, but it doesn't mean it's not true. The cruelty is the point now.
The cruelty is the point. The cruelty is the point.
Which brings us, and I appreciate this isn't what you've been addressing on this trip because it hadn't happened, but the comments Donald Trump has made yesterday about NATO and about... I mean, is there any pattern, Emily? You spend even longer looking at this stuff than I do. Is there any method in this madness? Do we see these two events, the hideous business unfolding across America, but particularly in Minneapolis, and the hideous comments that Donald Trump made yesterday? Are they part of the same piece, or are we just chronicling outbursts of aberration and outrage?
Well, I want to start by saying I was really moved by Nina's call and her poem to her son.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite easy for us as commentators to get hyperbolic about how crazy and how demented and how cruel, the man in the centre of this is. But actually, Nina's, such a sort of clear example of what happens when it touches people's lives. And I think that's what I would say links the two stories, that most of the time, you listen to the rambling Davos speech and you just think, this is a rambling Davos speech. It's kind of, there is no beginning and there's no end and there's no real sense. And I think we as journalists have to be really careful that we don't jump up and down and say, oh, the world is changing. Oh, this is it. Oh, this is terrible. I don't think it's actually what he says. I think it's the ramifications of what he says on the actions that other people take. So, for example, it's now the actions that the ICE agents are taking in Minneapolis, in his honour, in the same way that people 2 years ago wore those ear bandages when he'd missed an assassination attempt and his ear was bandaged. There is this sort of weird sense of fealty, and to prove your love to the president, you have to carry out more of what he says. And you have the mothers, the parents at the end of those comments who are just left picking up the pieces. And I think it's kind of a lesson for us, which is, we are so desperate to preserve this American alliance and so desperate to believe in the special relationship. God, how long have we been banging on about the special relationship for? But really, what's at the bottom of it? Because if he's going to mangle history, if you're going to send out your troops, if you are going to come to the support, and obviously he doesn't speak for most Americans. He doesn't speak, I don't think, for the vast majority who understand exactly what part British and NATO soldiers and troops played in Afghanistan and Iraq and in other conflicts that we've been through together. But if he mangles history to such a point where he just kind of makes you wish he hadn't even bothered, then isn't it going to make everyone think about where the relationship is now, what we do now?
And that's a question that Keir Starmer will hopefully be addressing sooner rather than later.